Okay, guys, I know this is not going to be as interesting as the prior presentation, because I actually am a little bit of a geek and I like playing around with some of these things. But I do want to talk about what's going on when you actually need to move your data sets from where they reside in an on-premises environment up into AWS. How do I do that? What do I do? Typically, folks think about, okay, I'm just simply going to move the entire data sets up into AWS, but that actually has some issues. So let's talk about what's going on in the world today. And a coworker of mine said this to me the other day. It's software is eating the world, and they're absolutely correct. It is eating the world. But in 2 years' time, we're expecting that 60% of global GDP is going to be digital as a result of things that are going on today, stuff that you see that AWS is offering to its various customers. And why do we worry about that? Well, we worry about that because success in the future is going to be a mixture of what you do today, but more predominantly, how you actually leverage the digital future that you're actually going to have to deal with. And one of my other co-workers says it's somewhat like the pizza shop. The pizza shop, I can go look up the menu online, I can decide what pizza I want, I can order it online, and I can go down to the pizza shop and get the pizza. Well, guess what? They don't have a data center behind that oven. They're leveraging the digital economy. In fact, someone else told me one time, you want to go down and buy a tire, you go down to the tire shop. Well, guess what? AWS is offering a chance for you to have your tires changed in your home, that someone will come to you and do what needs to be done. So a lot of things are going digital. So what does that mean for what Dell Technologies is providing? Most of you folks probably know Dell as we provide servers and storage and maybe networking components. We provide these sorts of devices. Well, guess what? It's a lot more than that. One of the things we do is we actually have a Dell Technologies Cloud, which actually allows customers that have an on-premises environment to move what they have there into AWS. And that actually is a different session. If you're interested in that, I would say head over to the Venetian, to the expo floor, and come talk to the cloud technologists we have on the booth down there. We also have cloud-enabled infrastructure, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. And the last thing is we actually have professional services and financing options that allow you to effectively run and consume things that you want from Dell Technologies in the same way that you consume from Amazon. You can subscribe to consume what you need on a needed basis, on a consumption basis. So the question that I always like to ask people is like, okay, you want to go to AWS. Where is your data today? If it's cloud native, you're probably fine. Most companies aren't cloud native. They've started with an on-premises data center. My data is in the data center, but I want to consume services in AWS. How do I do that? So what are you going to do with your data in the cloud? And across the top here, we have some of the most common use cases that our customers are telling us they want to do. They want to use it for disaster recovery, and that's probably a well-known use case. Another one is test dev. It's easier for me to run something up, run the tests, do my development in the cloud, and ramp it down so I don't actually have to invest in a large set of infrastructure just for my developers for the short period of time that they actually need to consume that. Another one is backup and archive. Again, that's a common use case that we hear about all the time. One that's really that's come a long way for Dell Technologies is the fact that we actually have customers that are doing healthcare and life sciences, and they want to consume the analytics engines that Amazon offer. But the data sets I've collected, they're in my data center. How do I do that? And the last one is, I really am going to move my workloads from where they are today in the data center. They're going to live in AWS forever. So workload migration's another one. So a couple of things that we actually have from Dell Technologies, cloud-enabled infrastructure things, and we call these Cloud Data Insights, the ability to know what's going on in my data center and in my AWS environment where I'm actually running some of my applications and consuming storage. And we actually have two products in this area. One is Cloud IQ. It's a software program that actually will run and monitor what's going on with your storage infrastructure, whether it be in AWS, whether it be on premises, and let you know the health of your environment. And again, if you're interested in this, head over to the Venetian, to the Sands Expo, and we can actually show you what goes on with Cloud IQ. But literally, it will actually identify things like noisy neighbors. any actually problems that you may have in your storage environment, whether it be, again, in AWS or on premises, and actually provide suggestions to actually solve the problems that it detects. The last one we've got is for unstructured data sets. That's Clarity Now. That will actually allow you to move your data sets from your Isilon storage platform up into, or ECS, which is Object Store, up into AWS and back again, or monitor how these things are working and whether you actually need to do anything. We also have something we call Cloud Connected Systems. And this is the way I can actually move my data sets from my on-premises storage arrays up into AWS. Dell EMC Unity Cloud Tiering Appliance allows us to move data that's actually on your Dell EMC arrays up into AWS, into S3 buckets or EBS stores, and that's where they'll reside forever after. You can move them back again if you want. And Isilon Cloud Pools, which allows you to actually have the movement of the data sets from your on-premises environment up into the cloud. Now, the beauty about this is that as far as the applications that are consuming the data is concerned, they don't know that it's been moved. It's been moved transparently. The metadata for these things still reside in the data center, but the actual data is now somewhere else, and they can consume it as they need. And then we actually have cloud data services. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But basically, any of our storage arrays are able to provide access for the data sets they can contain to AWS. So you can actually use your compute or the SaaS services that AWS is providing and consume the data that's actually on your on-premises storage arrays. And we'll talk about that in a little more. And the last thing we actually offer is, okay, I actually want to have my data sets on premises, but I want them to actually also be available on VMC on AWS. So my VMware environment on premises and my VMware environment in AWS, and I want the data sets to be in both places and replicating between the two. And it's what Unity Cloud Edition allows you to do. It actually runs in VMC as a software-defined storage product, and it connects to our on-premises Unity arrays and replicates between the two. So one of the things I said is we actually can allow you to take your data sets on premises and bring them up into AWS without actually copying them into AWS itself, but make them accessible from AWS. This particular instance, this is actually saying I actually have a VMware environment on premises and I want to be able to move my VMs under certain circumstances that I control up into AWS or perhaps back again. And we can do that from our two main storage platforms, Dell PowerMax and Unity. And what we're doing is we're actually replicating the data sets over into a co-location facility where you're actually paying for the consumption of the data that you move up here. You choose what you want to replicate. But these colos are actually right near AWS data centers. And we actually have a direct connect from our colos into the AWS data center. What that allows me to do is to actually have my data sets available for consumption in VMC on AWS with something like a 1 to 2 millisecond turnaround. So it's just like being on premises. And I can actually go do what I need to do. One of the scenarios that we use this for is actually failover, VM failover. So I actually want to have selected VMs in my data center tagged to failover to VMC on AWS should there be a disaster declared in the main data center. And this is one of the very common use cases we have for this environment. Again, it's triggered by the customer declaring an emergency. I want to actually then fail my VMs over. Now, it doesn't have to be an actual emergency. It's just that I want to move the VMs out from on-premises to VMC on AWS. A most common use case for this is some of our retail customers. They actually move during like this season when it's heavy user and customer interaction, they move the back-end processing up into VMC on AWS to free up on-premises resources to handle the customer interactions they need. And when the high season's over, they move the VMs back. Another one that is actually a very interesting for us is we can actually just expose the data sets. We don't need to move the VMs up. We can just expose the data sets into either VMC on AWS or onto AWS itself. And the most common use case for this one we have is some healthcare organizations. They actually do targeted healthcare for individual diseases based upon the customer's own profile. So we actually they take DNA samples, they collect those DNA samples in their on-premises storage platforms, replicate it to the colo. expose that to the AWS analytics services they use, and bring those data sets back down. And based on that, they actually target specific regimens of care for those patients based upon the disease they have and their DNA profiles. We actually also have the same thing happening for life sciences, for genomic analysis as well. So there is one last use case that I will talk about, and that is VMware Site Recovery. I can take my on-premises storage and VMs, and I can move them up into VMC on AWS. Now the catch with this one is that the larger the data set, the longer it takes to actually replicate the data up to AWS. So this is great for small data sets or small amounts of VMs that you absolutely have to move up very quickly using VMware Site Recovery. But the best use case for moving these things over is to use the one I talked about before, where we're actually replicating the data to a colo and then presenting that using Direct Connect into the VMC on AWS environment. One of the other things about this is that it doesn't have to be Dell EMC storage. It can be a third-party storage platform that you can move the data sets up. And at that point in time, you can actually then copy the data sets down into the colo and have them secured in the colo as well. So basically what we've talked about is the sorts of things you can do. I can actually run my cloud-connected systems directly into AWS. I can actually move over into data services where I actually have my data sets still under my control but available for consumption in AWS. And over all of that, we actually have Cloud Data Insights, which allows you to monitor and manage the data sets that you're using. So one last thing I do want to do is I'm going to actually show you what it's like to actually have this experience of moving stuff up. So I've actually got a demo here. So we actually have our own monitoring and management tools that run for the storage platforms in the data center, and we're just having a quick look here at what's going on in the data center. And we can see there's actual activity going on my arrays, but I'm actually going to move some of my VMs from on-premises up into VMC on AWS. Now up the top here, I've got two tabs. One is the tab of what I'm doing to actually fail over from my VMware environment in my on-premises data center, and the second tab is my my SDDC manager, so it's VMC on AWS what's running. So right here we've actually got a couple of data stores and some VMs that are running in my on-premises data center. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select a data store that I am actually going to make sure is fully replicated into the co-location facility. So making sure that it's actually in sync with the last updates that happen on the on-premises array. And then I'm going to actually select the VM that I'm going to move to fail over. Now the VM and that data set happen to go together, I know that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move this data set and the VM up into VMC on AWS. Double check to make sure I'm doing the right one. Yes, I am. And now what's interesting, you'll see that both the VM and the data set are now offline. They're actually now over in the SDDC manager. So now I need to flip over to the SDDC manager, and I need to go actually have a look to see what's going on here. So I'm going to actually have a look and see, yes, the files I wanted, well, actually, no, let me look at the right set. The files I wanted are actually moved over, and they're available now in VMC on AWS. Now, they didn't move into the cloud. They're still in the colo, but they're being exposed to VMC on AWS. So I've got those there. So now what's going to happen is I'll have a look at the VMs coming up in just a second. But what I want to point out, as they come up, you'll notice that the actual VMware environment will go out of balance. Right now, DRS is keeping it perfectly balanced. This will move a little bit to the right. But what's going to be interesting is you're going to see these VMs come online, and the consumption is suddenly going to start to increase as the environment comes online. So let's go have a look at this. And we can see the VMs are starting to come up. And if I actually look over here, this has popped out of balance, and now we're actually consuming more CPU and memory as these VMs, the applications kick into life and keep going. So what's actually just happened there is exactly what would happen if you were actually going to move your data sets and VMs from on-premises up into VMC on AWS. And it is as simple as that. Admittedly, I only moved a small amount of data and a single VM or VM setup, but the whole idea is that you can have this up and running in minutes. And with that, I thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm sorry you missed it, but it will be on again tomorrow.